of us as possible are there. I think that is a good blessing for each one of us. With the Unlock Revelation meetings, that means that many nights already, many nights still to come, a lot of studying from Revelation. So we're going to look at Revelation quite a bit, and that's good. And so for the next month or so, as we focus on Revelation, we'll be studying and reading through Revelation. And so today I want to look at the author of Revelation. I want to talk about John, the author of Revelation. As we study Revelation, look at the book, but also we'll think about the author today and who wrote it. In AD 155, there in the city of Smyrna, you know, is the crushed church, suffering persecution, there was Polycarp. Polycarp was hiding in a barn, and he was found, and so they hauled Polycarp off to the Colosseum, and there they said, "Curse the Christ and live." Polycarp responded, 86 years have I served my master and king, and he has done me no wrong. I dare not blaspheme him now. So that's where he was killed. Died as a martyr there. But where did he get that courage from? Where did he learn to trust God like that? In some way, it had to have been from his mentor, which was John. Polycarp was a disciple of John, just as John was a disciple of Jesus. So that was his mentor, and I think that's where some of that courage and trust came from. When Jesus was here working, there were thousands that were around him. Thousands would have been around him at times. You know, we see the stories when he fed so many, and he'd go from one place to another, and there thousands would come because he was preaching there. There were hundreds that were in the network. And so if Jesus went to a new city, there would be some families who would feed him, take care of him and his disciples, you know, have a place for them to sleep, hosting them there. So there were hundreds in the network wherever Jesus went. There were a dozen disciples, 3 in the inner circle, and 1 disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's John. John trusted Jesus enough to forsake prosperity. Look at John's background. Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1 verses 19 and 20. Mark 1 verses 19 and 20. Jesus here, when he had gone a little further thence, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who also were in the ship, mending their nets. And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship with the hired servants, and went after him. Most everyone was poor back then. Most everyone was poor. And here, look at this family. They own a business, right? They're fishing, they own a business, and their business is doing well enough that they have servants. Hired servants, there it says, right? With the hired servants with an S on the end, more than one, right? So they own a business, they have servants, and they also know some powerful people. John chapter 18. John chapter 18. Verses 15 and 16. John chapter 18, verses 15 and 16. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. John knew powerful people, and powerful people knew John. They knew that family. You know, we have certain families here in America that if you're part of that family, you have that right last name, then, yeah, we've seen your picture somewhere, right? We know the name. We know who you are. Well, that would be John. A little bit different culture in some ways, but still, we know that name, we know that family, we know who these people are. A powerful family. Back then, there was no middle class. Today, we have a lot of folks that are somewhere in that middle class. Back then, that really wasn't the case. You were either poor, and most folks were, or you were a rich family. John is coming from a rich family. That's his background. Coming from a rich family. a traveling rabbi. Isn't that what he would be? A traveling rabbi. Jesus says, come follow me. A traveling rabbi who has nothing, no place to sleep, no nothing, and he comes and he says, come follow me. John left houses, more than one. We think that he probably had a house in Jerusalem. That's how he would know the high priest, is you'd have a house in a big city and a house out there where they do their work. So they left houses. John left the business. He left the servants. He left the wealth to follow Jesus. We have people who leave something like that behind to go. I think in my mind about Cliff and Cindy. Cliff and Cindy, they went down to Georgetown, Guyana, down in South America. It's a very poor country. They had 4 kids, and at that time the youngest was not even in kindergarten. Cliff and Cindy, they well educated. She was an RN, and he had some good education as well. Their destination was so far out in the country that the only way to get there was fly. And so they get out there. There's no electricity, no houses, no boats, nothing, just disease. Right? Why would they go out there? They're smart. Why would they go out there? Think about it. You know other missionaries. You've heard of other missionaries. Similar situation. Why do those missionaries do that? Because they trust Jesus enough to forsake prosperity. John also trusted Jesus to risk his life. You know, at the crucifixion, there were some women there, and the disciples were hiding, right? Except for John. He trusted Jesus in the worst circumstances. It was easy to follow Jesus when Jesus turned water into wine. Who wouldn't want to be there for that, right? That was easy to follow that. When Jesus walked on water, that'd be awesome to see. He was there for that. When Jesus feeds 5,000, everybody loved that. When he fed 4,000, everybody loved that. When Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb, that's awesome. But when Jesus was naked, crucified, and the powerful people of society were against him, that would be a hard time to follow Jesus. But John was there. John trusted Jesus to risk his life in the hard time, even the hardest times. Judy Anderson grew up as a daughter of missionaries. She came from the Evangelical Covenant Church in the Old Congo. And there'd been missionaries there for a while. And when she was a little girl, there was a celebration that she still remembers to this day. They were celebrating 100 years since the missionaries came. It was a big celebration. The whole area had changed because of the missionaries. And it was a big celebration, a way to express some gratitude to the missionaries and have a good celebration. And near the end of the day, there was an old man who stood up and he said, I need to tell a story. So they let him tell a story. And he said, I know something that no one else here knows. I've got this from some old person some time ago. And I will die soon, and so I need to tell this story now. 100 years ago, the missionaries came. Nobody knew them. Nobody knew anything about them. Nobody here knew anything about God, and nobody knew anything about this book that they had. And so the old elders gathered together, and the question was, can we believe them? How can we know? We must have some kind of test. And so they came up with a test, they talked about it, and they decided that they would poison one and see the reaction. They would poison a missionary and see the reaction. And pretty soon, a little preschooler girl, a little preschooler girl got sick. She got sicker, and she died. You know, these missionaries had come to establish a church, right? And what's the first thing they have to start? A cemetery. A few weeks later, a husband in another family got sick and died. And then a wife of a third couple. And then another child. That's a lot of missionaries going down pretty quickly, right? And they watched each one. And the villagers watched those missionaries die. They watched the reaction of the other missionaries around them. And then they decided the message must be true. Look at the response. The way that they're responding, they thought the message that they have must be true. Would you give up and go home? With those folks dying, everybody dying around, doing their best to take care of each other, but to have folks getting sick and dying, sure seems like it'd be easy to give up and go home at that point in time. Seems like that might even be the smart thing to do. But those missionaries, they trusted Jesus enough to forsake prosperity and risk their life, even if nobody knew about it for 100 years, right? Same thing with John. He trusted Jesus enough to leave prosperity, to risk his life, and remain anonymous about it. My Bible says, at the beginning of John, it says, the Gospel according to St. John. But when I read through the book of John, John's name is never in there at all. Not in there. Why? Why is he never mentioned? You know our names are really important to us, right? My name is Malcolm. I was born on January 12, 1980, which was the 45th birthday of my grandfather. And so I got my grandfather's name, Malcolm. It's not a really common name. Maybe the most famous one is Malcolm X. Since he has the same name, I had to read his autobiography. Maybe some of you remember Malcolm Jamal Warner. He played Theo on The Cosby Show. Malcolm. There's the author, Malcolm Gladwell. He's written some fairly popular books. Malcolm McDonald, Malcolm Meany. He's from Star Trek. And there's not a lot of other Malcolms out there that you hear about. I've never met someone and said, hi Malcolm, I'm Malcolm. Never meet anybody with that name. You know, we're sensitive about our names, right? You have your name, you have your way of spelling it. We like to greet each other by name when possible, and we like to know somebody by name. If you know them by name, then that's a good thing, right? And we like it spelled correctly. My grandfather received a gift as he retired. It said, happy retirement, Malcolm, M-A-L-C-O-M. And he'd worked there for 35 years. 35 years, and he misspelled his name, right? And even though he never went by the name Malcolm when he was at work, he always went by the name Mac, and that was what was embroidered on all of the shirts that he wore at his company still. Why'd they misspell my name, right? You know, we're kind of sensitive about that. And look at John. John was willing to have his name never mentioned. Right? Never mentioned. The name of Jesus, that was an important name to John. That was good. Needed the name of Jesus. If John's name was never used, fine. If people loved to name their kids John for the next 2,000 years, that was up to Jesus. Right? John said, I don't care. I don't need my name in here. That's up to God. If he wants to have people name their kids John, fine. But he's going to leave that to Jesus. He trusted Jesus with that. Many times you have heard the question, do you trust Jesus? Right? And I'm sure you've had some other preacher say that. You've read that. You've thought that. You've been asked that. Do you trust Jesus? I hope you trust Jesus enough to forsake prosperity, to risk your life even in difficult times, and to remain anonymous if necessary. But there's more to the relationship that John has than that. John trusted Jesus, and Jesus trusted John. Jesus trusted John with the gospel. We have the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and if you read them, they're all very similar. They're mostly the same order, a lot of the same stories, a lot of similar things. And you read the book of John, it's totally different. Right? Totally different. Very different stories. A lot of different events. A lot of different things. Totally different. John chapter 21, verse 25. The very last verse of this book of John. John 21, verse 25. Here's John as he finishes his gospel. John 21, verse 25, he says, there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. For 3.5 years, Jesus did daily wonders. Miracles by the hour, right? Constantly doing incredible wonders every day for 3.5 years. And John has 21 chapters. What did he leave out, right? He had to leave out a lot of stuff. And he has to put in things that are just right. If John wasn't trusted with the gospel, we wouldn't have John 3:16, right? That's the only gospel that has John 3:16 in it. If John wasn't trustworthy, then we wouldn't have the gospel of John. If John wasn't trustworthy, we wouldn't have the book of Revelation. Jesus trusted John with the gospel of John. He trusted John with the message of Revelation. You know, there's no other book like Revelation, right? And he says, all right, John, I've got to trust you with this. You're the only one who's going to get this. It's going to be up to you to take care of this here. Jesus trusted John with the gospel, with the book of Revelation, and Jesus trusted John with his love. How do we describe John in the book of John? We say it's the disciple whom Jesus loved. We wish Jesus loved everybody exactly the same, don't we? Isn't that your assumption? Right? That's our assumption. That's the feeling that we like to have. But the reality is, Jesus loved John more. Right? Isn't that what that means? Jesus loved John more. He was his best friend. I think that humanity in Jesus needed a best friend. And that was John. And there would be potential for abuse there, wouldn't there? Jesus trusted John with his friendship. If we took a poll here at church and we found out who Jesus loves the most here, how would you feel about that? What if your name came up as Jesus loved you more here than anybody else here, right? Would you quickly get on your cell phone and tweet that? Right? Update your Facebook status. I'm Jesus' best friend, right? I'm the best one here, right? If you could, you'd get a t-shirt that says that. Wouldn't that be pretty cool? Think about it. You could write a book. Millions of Christians would buy it, right? You could be invited to lots of different churches. You'd be on a tour to many different places, and we'd love to hear from you. If you're Jesus' best friends, we want to hear from you, right? And so that's easy to abuse that relationship. And yet Jesus trusted John with the relationship, and it was not abused. Jesus trusted John with his mother. John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, he said to his mother, Woman, behold thy son. And he said to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home. Jesus was crucified. It was hard for him to speak. When you are crucified, your death is usually by asphyxiation. That means that the air is trapped in, and it's hard to get it out. And yet, his mother is important enough that he has to say something about that. Not a lot of things are said when Jesus is crucified, but he has to say something about her mother, about his mother. In that culture, the oldest son is responsible for the mother. It was understood. The oldest son would be the one taking care of the mother. His brothers are not there. And Jesus just needed somebody to care for his mother. And there was one man he knew he could trust. John. Tradition says that the disciple John stayed in Jerusalem. All of the other disciples spread out, and they went to different places as missionary works, but tradition says that John stayed in Jerusalem until Mary died, because it was his job to take care of Mary. So he kept her in Jerusalem until she died. Do you trust Jesus? I hope so. Can Jesus trust you? Can he trust you with his gospel? Jesus needs you to build relationships, to make friends with non-church friends. He needs you to speak to strangers, to give out our books that we have, Steps of Christ, The Great Hope, or some other missionary book that you've read that you like. Share it with people. Jesus needs witnesses for him in every place. In rich places, in hard places, in poor places. I hope your answer is yes, I trust Jesus. And I hope your answer is Jesus, you can trust me. Our closing hymn is number 186 and 186.
Such a friend we love.
Dear Jesus, we're thankful that you're our friend. We ask that you'll help us to be good friend to you, that we'll be trustworthy with the gospel, that we'll be good witnesses for you. Bless us and be with us. Thank you for being our friend and being close to us. Draw us closer to you every day. Amen.
Amen.